Hello, comrades. Today's lesson looks at British industry during World War II. Now, we've already looked at British agriculture and the kind of changes and successes that it had during the war. So, today we're going to look at British industry during the war. Just a reminder of some of the questions that you can get in the exam. Now, you'll notice that with these questions, while they are a bit different, basically they're only asking you about two things. They're really asking you about either success or changes. What was successful or what changed. So for the first one, it's about success in agriculture and industry. The second one is about changes in industry. The third one is again about success in agriculture and industry. The next one is about changes in industry. And the last one is about changes in agriculture and industry. So uh, a clear thing to remember is that as long as you understand the changes that happened during the war, then you can answer both types of questions. Because if you understand the changes, then you know what the successes were. Because obviously some of those changes led to successes and some of them led to failures. So both questions are force you to evaluate slightly differently, but the kind of the information, the facts, the statistics that you will need will be the same. And just a reminder, the difference between industry and agriculture. Industry is about turning raw materials into manufactured goods. However, as I said before, this tends to include coal mining during World War II, and agriculture is goods on farms, basically. So, last time we looked at how Britain fed itself. Now we're going to look at how they armed herself during the war. And just a reminder, as I said, about the questions, they can either ask you about industry and agriculture together, or they can ask you about industry, the industrial labour force by itself. So for the industry and agriculture ones together, it's just looking at basically what happened in factories and what happened on farms and the amounts that they produced. When we're talking about the industrial labour force, that basically just means workers. So when you're talking about the changes that happen to the industrial labour force, you can talk about changes that happen to workers. So that can be anything. So for example, if you were talking about the changes in industry and agriculture during the COVID pandemic, you would only really talk about people's jobs in industry and their jobs on farms and the things that they produced and how that works. But if you talked about how the lives of workers changed during the COVID pandemic, you talk about their jobs, but you could also talk about their home lives, about their social lives, about, you know, the amount of Netflix they watch, those kind of things. So if the question is quite general like that about industrial labor force or something, the labor force is just the workers, so you can talk about basically anything that happened during the war. You could talk about fear from death due to bombing or the loneliness that they felt, that a lot of workers felt being moved around, or you could talk about the fact that a lot of workers became women, all those kind of things. Okay, moving on to actually talking about industry. So, industry is basically about the workers. It's about the workers and what they produce. So let's start off by thinking about the workforce. During the war, a huge problem in Britain is that there are a real shortage of skilled workers. Now, by skilled workers, we mean people that are educated to do certain things. Now, you could be educated to be a draftsman. That means someone that draws up plans that are used to make ships or to make tanks and things like that. You can be an engineer that kind of fixes things. You could be a machinist that uses machine tools to make things. Basically, a skilled worker is something that the average person on the street couldn't do. So you couldn't just go into a factory and do a skilled job. You'd need some training. You'd need some education. You need these skills. So there are a lot of industries that need skilled workers, and so some of them would offer very high wages in order to poach them from other factories. And this particularly happened with aircraft factories because aircraft factories could pay higher wages because their product was more expensive and there was a bit more of a premium on it, so there was more kind of leeway for the factory owners to pay their workers a bit more. So this meant that workers weren't efficiently moved around, that they ended up going to the place that paid them best, so being led by capitalist factors, basically where we make the most money, rather than by production factors, which are more kind of perhaps communist socialist ideas about how can we make the most amount of stuff. Because of the importance of key workers, so skilled workers are prevented from joining the armed forces. So if you were a skilled draftsman or a machinist or an engineer, you weren't allowed to sign up. Ernest Bevin, who is the Minister of Labour, the Minister of Work, is someone who is a trade unionist. He's very left wing, and so he saw it as his job to kind of balance this triumvirate, this triangle, and the triangle of production. And when it comes to things like this, is government, workers, and factory owners. So those three groups had to be in balance, and so Bevin spent a lot of time trying to work with the unions and the owners, the employers, so that there was no issues arising, so that they didn't fall out, because if they fell out, then production would stop. The other really important thing to remember is that women became key workers. 46% of women between 14 and 59 were doing paid work for the war effort by 1943, so by the kind of the mid-end point of the war. A huge number of women are working in factories, doing farming, or in the armed forces. As we've mentioned before, there are these very strong allegations when we were talking about conscription about that the better off we're able to avoid doing the difficult jobs. So hard manual labour, being in the coal mines, being on the farms, maybe being in the particularly unpleasant factories. And so this is quite an important thing to talk about if you're talking about the industrial changes, and you can say that this is a failure because there's this belief, and it is a fact of life for a lot of people. And as well as that, there's another class element that exists, that during the war, during the early part of the 20th century, the workers are a much more radicalised group. They are pretty left-leaning. They are very keen to see representation, to see changes brought in, because in the 40s and the 30s, remember, things had been very bad for workers. They didn't have healthcare. They didn't have an extensive unemployment insurance. That things could be very bad if you were a poor person, a working class person in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And so there was a real desire among a lot of workers for change. This leads to kind of political radicalisation, people being very left wing. And during the war, there was some sense of a feeling that the workers were doing all the work and the employers who owned the factories were making huge profits out of a time of national crisis, that they were making a huge amount of money because the government had to buy a lot of things. So there was a significant amount of industrial unrest, and industrial unrest is just strikes when people basically withdraw their labour. They refuse to work because of a problem. Sometimes it's wages, sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's working conditions, sometimes it can be someone is unfairly sacked. And as I said, this kind of left-wing radicalism among workers meant that for many, the employers remained the enemy, and there were a lot of days lost to strike action during the war. And as the war went on, this actually increased, even though it was illegal to go on strike. But you obviously, if a workforce goes on strike, thousands of workers in a mine or a factory go on strike, you can't put them all in prison. And that obviously caused a lot of problems with the government. The Clyde shipbuilding industry is a big issue in terms of striking workers, and Jack Jones, as a historian, talks about that a lot of managers tried to keep the kind of pre-war managerial practices where they were very much trying to force profit margins up and kind of workers' rights down, and that didn't really fly well during the war. So trade unions are patriotic, but they don't give up fighting for their members. They fight over pay, over job protection, and also quite extensively over the role of women. There was a lot of debate about the role of women, and that's something we'll talk a bit more about when we do the kind of war and society stuff. But some trade unions fought quite aggressively to make sure that the kind of primacy of men in the workplace was maintained. Some did fight to try and equalise the pay differential between men and women, to make sure that men and women were paid about the same. But there's a lot of push among trade unionists to make sure that men's role as the kind of the prime people in the workplace were maintained. But trade unions also did a lot with education, and they really focused on making sure that the men that came out the armed forces and who were out of the mines and things like that they were educated, that they could read, their minds were expanded, they had a kind of good basis of education. As I said before, a bit of trade union opposition to women members and women in skilled occupations, because there was this traditional idea, even though workers were maybe economically left-wing, they weren't so much kind of socially left-wing as we recognise today, and so they pushed quite a lot of them for this idea that women in the workplace was just a temporary thing, and that after the war they would return to their traditional roles as carer and mother. One of the important things to remember is that we look back on the war as a war that we won. So we don't really. It's sometimes quite hard to think that actually remember that actually during the war wasn't obvious that we were going to win. Especially there were some real dark days for the British. That kind of 1942, 1943, there were victories, but the victories were quite far abroad, and there were places that maybe no one had really heard of, and so it was quite difficult to kind of build up enthusiasm and really get behind that, and that caused a lot of problem. So A.J.P. Taylor highlights the period between mid 43 and kind of mid 1944 as being particularly bad for strikes because people weren't sure that they were going to win, and there was no enthusiasm for the war, and this meant that they wanted change. Now it's easier to encourage people, right? You've got to keep on fighting, like we're winning, we're doing well, and that can kind of drive momentum forward. So when I say industrial demands, what I mean is that what demands did industry put on the country? So and one of the main demands is for people. But by 1945, by 1943, sorry, Britain had run out of workers. That they had mobilised basically everybody. All women and all men who could work were working, and you couldn't take it any further. So the other problem was also that birth rate had gone down between the war, and a lot of older workers were beginning to leave employment because they were just too old, and there were not enough young people to replace them. So there's the real kind of problem, and so Britain is faced with this dilemma that they had to choose between they're either going to have to limit production or they're going to have to cut back in the armed forces. But instead, Britain solved that problem by just borrowing more money from America, and so they imported massively from America. And you can see in 41, 10% of British munitions came from America. By 43, it's 27. By 44, it's 28.7. So more than a quarter, a significant amount. Same one again. So another really important part of the industrial understanding is to think about, right, so what role did government play? So government took a huge amount of control over industry during the war. And if you remember in the 30s, there was this real kind of hands-off approach that the kind of laissez-faire capitalism of the Conservatives and Neville Chamberlain, he didn't want to directly intervene in the economy. That is the traditional kind of right-wing view on the economy. But during the war, it was a very left-wing policy for a lot of people, especially led by Bevan and Attlee, who had a huge amount of influence over the home front. And so the government began to really get its hands into industry and get involved and get its hands dirty. It was an interventionist policy, and that is a real kind of element of socialism. So Bevan gets made Minister of Labour in 1940, and he turns the Ministry of Labour into a hugely powerful State Department because basically Bevan had control over the workers. And so in order to do anything during the war, you needed people. And so Bevan could decide who got extra workers and who didn't, and that gave him a huge amount of power. Regulation 58A gives the power to basically force individuals to register for work and then direct them to wherever they want. So basically, you could be told where to go. Everybody in the country was subject to this. Anyone that resigned or was fired, the government had a record of that, and if they were out of work, they weren't allowed to stay out of work for very long, and they were very quickly found another job. That at the peak point, kind of in the 1943, 1944, 10 million people were in active service or employed in the munitions industries. That's a huge number of people, an almost unbelievable number of people working either directly fighting or making weapons for them to use in the fighting. Now, Bevan was very keen on the voluntary principle. As I say, he was a trade unionist. He didn't want to force people to do what they didn't want, and so he tried to encourage people to choose to do things, even if that choice was only really an illusion. He tried to say, like, we really need you to do this. Will you do it? Yes. And if they said no, then maybe the kind of the iron fist within the velvet glove was displayed there. Because he'd seen there were huge problems during World War I with strikes and issues like that, and so he didn't want that to be repeated. So he tried to use volunteering as much as possible. So only 250,000 men and 90,000 women were forced to do things perhaps that they didn't want to do out of a huge workforce. So that's quite an important thing to remember. But the Control of Employment Orders under the Emergency Powers Act did mean that they could mobilise groups of workers wherever and whenever they were needed. So you could move from Glasgow to Derby, or from Cardiff to Manchester, if you were needed there. And this tended to be mainly for single men and women. People with families or married people tended not to be forced to move, but it did sometimes happen. So 8 million employees affected by essential work orders, which basically meant that they were limited in their rights. It was difficult for them to resign, and it was very difficult for them to be sacked. For example, engineering, coal, shipbuilding, iron and steel, the really important industries during the war, you couldn't leave the job and you couldn't be fired, so you were basically stuck there. And while as we said, there were very few people that were forced to do anything. A lot of people were aware that if they tried to do something, then they wouldn't be allowed to. And so, again, the idea of they were voluntarily doing it, but their kind of voluntary nature was actually an illusion. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to go through some figures just so you can get an idea of the kind of amount of stuff that Britain was producing during the war. So aircraft are hugely important. The Battle of Britain, the Battle of the Atlantic, and all those kind of things. Planes were vital for both of those campaigns and for very many others during the war. And so aircraft production goes up massively during the war. Prior to the Battle of Britain, Britain is producing 256 planes a month. By July, which is only a couple of months later, they're producing just under 500, so a huge rise. And this is one of the things that you can point to and say, well, this is one of the reasons why Britain won the Battle of Britain, was because of the massive improvement in aircraft production. But bomber production doesn't quite keep up that same pace. It's very difficult to produce bombers, especially 4-engine bombers, because you need 4 engines for them, and building engines is very difficult. Plus, there are a huge number of parts. A bomber is a very difficult thing to produce. And so heavy bombers are obviously in huge demand. There's a shortage of them, and this is again something you talk about in the Battle of the Atlantic, because 4-engine bombers are going to fly a lot further. So they are the kind of VLR planes, the very long range planes, and it would have been perhaps better if Britain could have produced more of them to help out. Huge number of industries required in each aircraft, and around about just under 2 million people producing the planes for the RAF, and this obviously produces a huge boost for a lot of industries that have been really struggling during the war. And then we've got some figures, and you can see that in 1938, 3,000 planes are being produced. By 1944, they're producing 26,500, so an unbelievable increase. Then weapons productions, again, weapons productions and vehicle industry massively increase during the war. The production is very significant, and supply problems really begin to kind of disappear. The machine tools, which are things that you need in order to make other things, so kind of machines to make planes and things like that, is something that Britain isn't very good at making, and they import a huge number of them. But they do increase quite significantly, and during the war there's quite a big increase in them. As the need for weapons increased, the number of factories producing inessential goods turned into factories producing essential goods. So football factories starts making gun carriages, and chocolate factories starts producing rockets. Just 2 examples that I've always liked. They're in, I can't remember which book, but one book, and it's quite a good example to remember. And for example, the British Army has a huge glut. That means they've almost got too many of some things. Shells is one thing they have a huge number of. Shells are important during the war, World War II, but perhaps not as important as during World War I, and so they end up with a huge excess of shells. And there are some fields in Britain where there are just millions and millions of shells just laid out, and that is one of the things Britain's very good at producing. And again, we can see this is the increase in the amount of industrial production. This is the sort of thing you can talk about as a change and a success. 358% increase in vehicles, 1,000% increase in small arms, 1,000% increase in bombs and various things. So again, these are figures that you can use in your essays to kind of highlight various increases. Coal production, again, is very important during the war, but the important thing about coal is that coal production fell rather than increased, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Hugh Dalton, who's a Labour minister during the war, says that a large number of miners joined the army, and a lot of the remaining miners were very old, and so they were beginning to retire. So by 42, 40% of the workforce are over 40 and 20% over 50. It's obviously very hard to work if you're over 40 and 50, especially if you've been working down the mine, which is very hard on your body. So by 1945, there's double the number of absentees, so people who are off sick, than in 1939. The British government didn't introduce coal mining as a reserved occupation at the start, so a huge number of miners did join the army. By 43, 36,000 coal miners had joined the armed forces, or worked in other places because they got paid better. This led to the introduction of something called the Bevans Boys. So a ballot took place when you were conscripted, and you would end up in the mines rather than the armed services. There were few exceptions to people being conscripted. If you were past fit for flying duties, or if you were fit for submarine duties, then you could get out of being a Bevans Boys. But basically, any other job, you were made to go down the mines. You could be fined or sent to jail for refusing to go down the mines. That was seen as refusing to be conscripted. And around 50,000 people were conscripted to be sent down the mines, and it was a very difficult job. It was very unpleasant. They weren't very well trained. It was awful, and a lot of people referred to them as cowards because they wouldn't be seen in uniform when they were out and about in the street, and so a lot of them would be arrested and things like that, and it was quite difficult for them. And they were kind of maybe not treated or recognised as well, especially in the kind of post-war period. Okay, so quick look at the kind of historians used, because we'll look a bit more of that when we talk about the successes next time. But Corelli Barnett is very keen that Britain failed basically as an industrial power during the war, that there was very bad workplace relations between the workers and the managers, and everything was bad, basically. So Corelli Barnett is one to remember. He thinks that everything was bad for the British industry during the war. Paul Addison also agrees that things were bad. He says that industrial relations were really bad. There's a lot of strikes and a lot of kind of stoppage of working, particularly in coal mines. Penny Summerfield and Arthur Marwick are very keen on the importance of women, and so that's a real success and also a very big change. Stuart Hilton says that crime and antisocial behaviour changed massively increased during the war, and that's kind of as a result of the various changes that existed thanks to industrial changes. Nick Terethu is quite a good historian, talks about how, as I said, there was this real kind of radicalism among workers, and he said that this increased during the war because, again, there was a real feeling among some that the upper classes were continuing to profit and the working classes were suffering. And Martin Pugh is of the opinion that British industry actually did really well during the war, that there were some failures, but the kind of high-tech industries did particularly well. Okay, again, quite a complex thing there, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of the changes and the successes, and we'll kind of hopefully bring them all together next time.